All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, when we look through the modern history of the NFL, and I would say the modern history starts around 1980, most of the defensively dominant teams tended to be very frenetic, filled with chaos after a couple of seasons or so, because the defensive side of the ball is so emotional. That is the portion of the team that dominates the overall team. Your success is not going to last very long, because the energy that the defense needs to be successful is different from what the offense needs to be successful. The offense has to be cool-headed because they have to execute. The defense oftentimes is galvanized by their emotions. And what you'll often find, especially on defensive teams, is that they try to marginalize or even denigrate the offense when they're the dominant aspect of the team. We saw it to a degree with the 85 Bears. We saw it to a degree with the 86 Giants. We saw it to a degree with the 2000 Ravens, I believe the 2002 Tampa Bay Bucks. We saw it with the 2014 or 2015 Broncos. And we especially saw it with the 2013-2014 Seattle Seahawks. And that's the point of this video. That team, the Seattle Seahawks, I'll never forget, and I've said this repeatedly on this channel, when they lost that Super Bowl to the New England Patriots, I said that team will never be the same ever again, because that was a traumatic experience. I'm not even a Seattle Seahawks viewer or quote-unquote fan. And just watching that game, those last couple of plays, that shit damn near traumatized me. I was like, did I just see what I just saw? I mean, it was unbelievable, and I knew that they would never, ever be the same, because they were so jealous of Russell Wilson. That defense was. The things that they said about him in the aftermath of that game, even leading up towards that game, the level of disrespect that they had for him, a quarterback who's been great from his first day in the NFL. There was never a time where Russell Wilson was not a great quarterback. Look up his stats. He was the highest rated quarterback in the NFL as a rookie. He led the league in quarterback rating, and he's been great the whole way through. This notion that Russell Wilson only became a great quarterback in the last 3 years, that's nonsense. It's just that it became more noticeable once beast mode was no longer in the backfield. But just to get back to the point, the defense was always jealous, and then they tried to hide their jealousy by creating this smokescreen of being woke in the last couple of years. Guys like Michael Bennett and Richard Sherman and a couple of other guys on their defense, they embraced the new woke movement of speaking out about social issues that they had no solutions for and things of that nature, just to get attention. It wasn't sincere. And I said last year or last season that Seattle was never going to win anything ever again because they were too woke. You have to be able to separate what you do as opposed to what you think or how you quote unquote feel about things. And this was during the Colin Kaepernick kneel for the national anthem stuff, where everybody was trying to get involved. And I told you guys even before Michael Bennett got involved that he was an asset. I told you guys that from before he got caught up in that situation in Las Vegas. Point being is this, that whole situation metastasized. And like I stated they would have to do, they just exploded that whole team. And they've become much better because of it, because players are now more focused on what their job is as opposed to what they want to say to the media after the game about some racial situation that oftentimes they have no understanding of. And as we know, Richard Sherman, the formerly great cornerback of the Seahawks, is now a cornerback for the 49ers. But he still feels the need to speak about Seattle Seahawks issues, which prompted one of the Seahawks' most celebrated defensive players to quote-unquote clap back at Richard Sherman. So, of course, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
In other NFL news, with a win over the Vikings on Sunday, Seahawks defensive end Frank Clark is letting everyone know the Richard Sherman era in Seattle is over.
You know what that means? That means that many of the defensive players in Seattle did not like Richard when he was there. And I'm on record as saying this about Richard Sherman. Very smart brother, but to let the super liberal sports media tell it, they try to act like this dude, reinvented the wheel, or like he's the smartest athlete we've ever seen in the NFL.
Clark, who leads Seattle with 11 sacks, is responding to the comments made by his former teammate last month. Sherman called Seattle a middle-of-the-road team. Talk about confidence.
Well, if Seattle's a middle-of-the-road team, what are the 49ers?
Clark in part said, quote, "He is not in this locker room no more, so his opinion really doesn't matter. They've got some problems over there in San Fran that he needs to be worried about."
He can't be worried about the problems in San Francisco because he's still thinking about Seattle. He left his heart in Seattle. That's the issue, Frank Clark. You know that, and I know that. Richard Sherman, he's another one. He's wokety woke. And you know what's so funny? I said this before about Richard Sherman. He was one of the original All Lives Matter Negroes. Remember that? He said all lives matter. That's what he was saying back in the day, back about 3-4 years ago. Now, after everything occurred with the downfall of the Seattle Seahawks, he started to become one of the wokety wokes. And now he just feels compelled to inject his opinion on everything, no matter what it is. And whenever somebody is that eager to inject their opinion on everything and they provide no empirical data to back up their opinions, they normally make a fool of themselves. Now, when it comes to Richard Sherman, we know that when it comes down to it, when he really wants to go hard, he'll normally come with receipts. But for him to talk about the Seattle Seahawks, even if they are fair to middling or whatever, worry about your team. Don't worry about them.
This is my team now. This is my defense. Richard Sherman, his era is over here.
In other words, we never liked his ass.
The Seahawks will clinch a playoff spot if they beat Sherman's 49ers this Sunday. Now back to First Take.
Middle of the road, let Sherman tell it. Max, let me ask you this. Was the Legion of Boom holding Seattle back?
Clearly, yes. The answer is yes.
I agree. They were stopping them from truly becoming an overall team because of their jealousy. As opposed to them just supporting their quarterback, they should have been appreciative of the fact that they had a top-tier quarterback as opposed to trying to make sure that they got all the credit for the greatness of the team. And that's another thing that we'll normally find from great defenses, especially in this modern-day NFL. They have this inferiority complex when it comes to quarterbacks.
Look, Legion of Boom was the dominant defense of its time. A couple of years ago, Stephen A., you and I debated.
I personally think that the Denver Broncos defense was better. The Broncos defense of 2015, I think, was better than the Legion of Boom.
Should they trade these guys now? Because as you reported, you were hearing things out of way back then, out of the Seattle locker room, that the defense was disgruntled because there was a sense that they were trying to make the team about Russell Wilson. And obviously they should have given the ball.
So they were not disgruntled, they were jealous.
Ball to Marshawn Lynch. About that, we both agree. But I thought it was smart for them to make the team about Russell Wilson, a great quarterback entering his prime, a future Hall of Famer entering his prime. Defenses in the NFL have about a 5-year, really, at most,
At most, at the absolute most. Really, normally around 3 years.
Lifespan as a unit. Defenses age because of the nature of the job. They age quickly, and they're dependent upon multiple players. So usually, if you can get a 5-year run out of a group of guys on defense, you did great.
Absolutely.
What's the old line? Trade them a year too early instead of a year too late. So when we had this debate, your point was, I don't mean to misquote as I recall, they're still great. And that was my point too. Yes, they're still great. Therefore, you can get a lot for them now. In another year, they'll only be good. You will get much less for them.
I agree because they were no longer championship level. After they lost that Super Bowl to the New England Patriots, they were never going to threaten for a championship ever again. So they should have traded them at the very least at the end of the next season.
You know the future's Russell Wilson. You know there's a rift on the team. You know you're going to choose the quarterback with 10 years ahead of him instead of the defense with a couple years ahead of them. Choose Russell Wilson. Get rid of those guys now. Get a ton for them and rebuild. They tried to split the difference. They held on to the defense too long. They traded parts and...
Yeah, the reason why they held on to the defense for so long is because Pete Carroll felt guilty about the decision that he allowed Darrell Bevell to make in that last offensive play in the Super Bowl. That's why. And you're never supposed to allow your decision-making to be predicated on guilt. Never supposed to do that, unless it's a legal situation.
And got some stuff back, but not the haul they would have gotten. They did not challenge for a Super Bowl in between. And that's why Seattle, as great a job as they've done rebuilding on the fly, is not in an even better position than they are right now. The Legion of Boom, because of their greatness, held them back.
I disagree. I've always disagreed with that. During the Legion of Boom...
Well, I don't know how hard you could disagree with it when the proof's in the pudding. They only won one Super Bowl. And let the record show, the reason why Seattle lost the second Super Bowl has very little, or at least not anywhere near as much to do with the decision to throw the ball on that last offensive play as it does the fact that the vaunted Legion of Boom, the so-called greatest defense of the 2010s, allowed Tom Brady to shred them up like old newspaper in the fourth quarter. They were terrible in that fourth quarter, and I've never once heard Russell Wilson say anything about that. He never once pointed the finger at that secondary that got shredded in the fourth quarter.
Well, remember, doing it, it wasn't just 2 years, it was 4 years. They were the #1 defense in the National Football League, #1. Number two, when you think about Russell Wilson in the era, understand, Max, that from a macro perspective, nobody disagreed with you. You understand that you got to hand the ball to the quarterback, and he's the face of the franchise because on and off the field, he just conducts himself in a fashion that breeds leadership to some degree, and it's something that we should applaud. But the flip side to it is that you don't negate or neglect to recognize the greatness of on the other side of the ball and the mystique.
Right, but how would they neglect it when Richard Sherman signed a major contract? All these guys were signing major deals. Now, I remember Cam Chancellor had an issue with his contract where he held out. But you're never going to pay a safety or cornerback the amount of money that you pay your quarterback. You're just not.
Mystique that they brought to your franchise. It wasn't just that your defense was #1.
And I will say this. The relationship or the rapport between the defense and Russell Wilson took a massive downturn when he signed that contract that pretty much made it prohibitive for anyone on the defense to get as much money as they thought maybe they could have or should have to keep the team together.
#1, it was the mystique that came along with it. It was Cam Chancellor, it was Earl Thomas. Richard Sherman was locking down one complete side of the field. Okay, so let's not minimize what he brought to the table. And when you talk about the Super Bowl, yes, it could still be Russell Wilson's team, and to give the damn ball to Marshawn Lynch at the half-yard line. Giving the ball to Marshawn Lynch at the half-yard line doesn't mean that the team doesn't belong to Russell Wilson. He'd have still probably been the MVP, but you cost yourself a Super Bowl when you did that.
Well, that was part of the theory, that they wanted Russell Wilson to throw the ball into the end zone because they did not want Marshawn Lynch to get the MVP of the Super Bowl, because that was in the aftermath of him saying, I'm just here so that I don't get fined.
So I'm going to Clark and what he just said about Richard Sherman. My response to him is that it is a new era. It's clearly over. Richard Sherman is there no longer. Mr. Clark, be respectful, please. Be respectful.
Well, Richard Sherman has to be respectful. You have to propagate respect in order to receive respect.
Respectful. Richard Sherman, when he was saying something, he didn't call out any players on the Seahawks.
Right.
He was obviously, when you did that great for that organization for so many years, there's a certain level of respect that you want. We saw Tony Dungy. I commented on this the other day when Tony Dungy was on Sunday Night Football, lamenting how a Super Bowl champion coach was let go. I said, you don't have a problem doing that with players. This is what Richard Sherman is talking about. When you accomplish the things that they accomplish, there's a certain level of respect that should come along with it. Clark needs to recognize that, because guess what?
No, what Clark needs to recognize is that we're in 2018. He's one of the captains of that defense. And he cannot allow a player on another team, especially a division rival, to try to assess his team when we know that there's an agenda there. There's a couple of agendas there. Number one, Richard Sherman is frustrated that he's no longer on the Seattle Seahawks. Number two, he's always going to talk down on that team because they're a division rival. If you're Frank Clark, it's not your job to say, you know what, it's okay what Richard said because he did great things here. Well, that's in the past. We're trying to do great things this year. That's how that goes.
It could be you next.
It will be him next. It happens to everyone. But I want to get back to this.
But how you handle it is what I'm trying to say.
Here's the problem that I have with your point of view about.
Yeah, but you know what, Steve? At the end of the day, it's like somebody with a chick, and the ex-man shows up, and the ex-man is saying, yo, you know what? That chick ain't shit, and blah, blah, blah. Well, if you with her for a reason. And if you're taking her seriously on some type of level, you are going to at least try to see it out until she shows a lot of the characteristics that the ex-guy is talking about, because the ex-guy could just be saying that because he wants the broad back. I mean, it is what it is. He could be right, he could be wrong, but you're living in the moment. You just have to be cognizant of things. And Frank Clark, he should be cognizant of the fact that he's replaceable as well. That's a part of life.
About the Legion of Boom. Evidence doesn't matter at a certain point. Like, here was the evidence. That era petered out, and they certainly got less for those players than they would have. So the idea not to...
Well, for some of them, they got nothing for him. I mean, they got nothing for Cam Chancellor. So far, they've got nothing for Earl Thomas.
To trade them is because you think you could make a run. They didn't, and then they got less for them. Here's my...
Why didn't they? They got hurt.
Well, okay, but that's what happens as you age, as you get older, as you're exposed to
It
risk.
happens when you're young in football.
Stephen A., had they traded them when I suggested they'd have gotten more for them, and they didn't challenge for a Super Bowl in between. And here's and this is the tough decisions are when they're still great. You should trade players when you go, damn, they're really great this year. Yes, that's why you got a haul for them. You don't wait until they decline. And my point is this, what would Belichick do? Belichick was fixing to trade Tom Brady or let him go. Belichick is unsentimental. The lack of sentimentality with Belichick is the reason they've been the greatest franchise in the history of football during this era of parity. That's the reason. He looks at it soberly, without sentiment at all, and gets rid of all kinds of players, no matter who they are.
Max, you're talking about two players. The fact of the matter is Bobby Wagner's still there. Earl Thomas was there before he got hurt. Okay, so we really talk about Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor.
That's true.
I know you.
Also, Michael Bennett.
You moved Michael Bennett or whatever. You had other guys on the defensive line, and from a cap consideration.
In other words, they were trying to get rid of all the woke dudes.
Purpose, you had to make.
Remember, Earl Thomas wasn't woke. Earl Thomas just wanted to go play for the Dallas Cowboys. And they should have moved him.
Make your moves, but the bottom line is we're really just talking about two players. Right. Let's not overreact like, oh my God, this complete metamorphosis that took place, this complete overhaul. That wasn't the case.
No, but it was the older, expensive players.
Question. He called.
And you always have to move a lot of the more worn-out members of the secondary.
He called them middle of the road. Do you think they're middle of the road, or do you think they're a little better? Sherman.
He called them middle of the road?
Yeah.
They're better than that.
They're better than that.
Well, it depends on how wide the middle of the road is. I mean, they're 8-5, but does anybody really think the Seahawks are going to win the championship? I'm not saying that what Richard Sherman said was wrong. I'm just saying that the reason why he felt compelled to put forth that sentiment is because he has a couple of agendas. If he has anything even moderately denigrating to say about his former franchise, he's going to say it. He's not going to be positive about it. He's going to try to put, kind of a, not so much a negative spin on it, but, just a dismissive spin on it. Like, they don't really have a chance to win a Super Bowl. And he's right. They're not going to win a chip.
They're better than that.
So he could be a little salty.
Well, he's comparing.
Oh, no, he's very salty.
Comparing it to what they were.
Of course.
All right. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're Clark, why not understand that?
It's not his job to understand something that a division rival says, Stephen A. Smith. It's his job to act as the captain of the ship. It's his job to be positive at all times. Now, 10 years from now, when they're both retired, then he can understand certain things. It's not your job to understand things now.
Why not
Do you
understand?
feel attacked though, and think people are calling you average?
If you say somebody by name, I'm all for that. If you know the history, and you know the history between Richard Sherman and the organization, and how ultimately things ended, you have
also
to take that into
history of Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman, people think he's insulting people. He's not. Richard Sherman says how he feels.
Well, I won't even so much say that he says how he feels. He does oftentimes, but for the most part, Richard Sherman will say what he knows because he will back it up with receipts. Point being is this: everything that you know, you don't necessarily have to say. Sometimes we say things that we know. We put forth harsh truth because we know that it's going to elicit an effect in the person or people that we're sending that remark towards.
How he feels. Remember when he said he thought Crabtree was average? That's mediocre, rather.
Yeah, he said mediocre. He's a mediocre receiver. Mediocre.
At the time, he was. He was a middle-of-the-pack kind of guy. He wasn't a lead guy, and out of college, maybe a lot of people thought he would be a lead guy. He got better after that.
Yeah, but you're saying this isn't accurate. He isn't.
I think he's...
They aren't middle of the road.
He's in the ballpark. Seattle's better than middle of the road. Richard Sherman, no, of course they're not going to be the Legion of Boom. That's an all-time great defense. Mm-hmm. They're high average. They're on the right side of things. But they're not like an elite Chicago Bears defense. He's right about that.
Last point. They're ranked 6th defensively right now, which was an upgrade because they've come on strong over the last few weeks.
That's right.
Prior to that 2-year window where you had the injuries that I just alluded to and stuff like that. 7th in 2011, ranked 7th. Number 1 the next 4 years, and number 3.
Yeah.
That's what Richard Sherman
right. He's comparing it to an all-time great.
This year, you can't deny that Pete Carroll's done a good job
He's done a great job.
Wagner and Clark. He really has. This team is back.
Seattle reminds me in certain ways of the NFC Chargers in that they are very well balanced right now.
And if they beat the Niners this weekend?
Oh, they're pretty well balanced. They're going to have a little bit more explosiveness in their passing game if they want to beat anybody good in the playoffs. But, I mean, we'll see. That 3 running back set that they have, I'm not sure how successful that's going to be in a big game in New Orleans or in LA. But I mean, who knows? I believe they almost beat the LA Rams twice this year. If I'm wrong about that, one of you brothers can correct me.
This weekend they get a playoff spot. All right, we'll keep moving.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. We'll see how things go for the Seattle Seahawks, as well as for Mr. Richard Sherman, who I think is setting himself up to be one of these top NFL analysts after his career is over. So peace.